The clink of heavy silver against fine china was the dominant sound in Bristow Bistro, a sound that usually signified discreet power lunches and deals sealed over seared scallops. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the starched white tablecloths and reflecting off the polished chrome, creating a brightness that felt almost artificial, a stark contrast to the conversation about to unfold. The air conditioning hummed with quiet efficiency, chilling the room to a temperature just shy of comfortable. It was a place designed for appearances, for transactions cloaked in civility. Calvin Rhodes, 39, felt the familiar weight of the silverware in his hand, but found the pan-seared branzino tasteless on his tongue. He'd arrived 10 minutes early, smoothing the lapels of his best charcoal suit, a knot of vague anticipation tightening in his stomach. A lunch invitation from Meredith Lane, CEO of Envia Robotics, wasn't an everyday occurrence. Usually, communication flowed through Marcus, his VP, and more importantly, his friend since their university days. He'd assumed this was about the upcoming Project Chimera milestones, the AI initiative he'd poured his soul into for the past 3 years. Meredith sat opposite him, a portrait of calculated composure in her tailored navy dress. Her gaze, when it met his at all, was brief, skimming over him rather than engaging. She made small talk about the restaurant's recent renovation, her voice smooth but lacking genuine warmth like polished marble. "Calvin," she began, placing her fork down with deliberate slowness beside a barely touched plate of quinoa salad. The shift in tone was subtle but immediate, cutting through the bistro's low hum. "We appreciate your contributions to Envia over the years." Truly. Calvin felt a prickle of unease. The corporate preamble. It never led anywhere good. "Thank you, Meredith. Chimera is shaping up. Envia is moving in a different strategic direction," she interrupted, her voice still level, betraying no emotion. She finally looked towards him, but her eyes seemed focused somewhere past his shoulder. "And as part of this realignment, your role as chief AI architect is being eliminated." The words hit him like a physical blow. The sounds of the restaurant, the distant chatter, the clinking cutlery, seemed to recede, replaced by a dull roaring in his ears. Eliminated. His mind scrambled, flashing through images. Late nights fueled by caffeine and code, the exhilaration of breakthroughs, the collaborative energy with his team, the easy camaraderie with Marcus, who had always championed his work. He thought of the server racks humming under his careful watch, the elegant complexity of the algorithms he'd built from scratch, algorithms that were poised to redefine their industry. Eliminated, he echoed, the word feeling foreign and absurd on his tongue. He forced himself to keep his expression neutral, a mask sliding into place honed by years of corporate meetings. Inside, the ground had given way. I don't understand. Project Chimera is exceeding all projections. The alpha tests were phenomenal. "The decision isn't performance-related, Calvin," Meredith said, the statement somehow colder than an accusation. "It's a matter of resource allocation. There have been concerns raised regarding the utilization of company resources." Resource utilization. The vagueness was infuriating, insulting. What resources? My team has been meticulous with the budget. The server usage for Chimera is entirely within the approved parameters. He thought of the small side project he occasionally ran simulations for, testing a theoretical quantum entanglement model, purely conceptual, using minimal off-peak processing power. Surely not that. It was negligible, a sandbox experiment he'd even casually mentioned to Marcus. Meredith waved a dismissive hand, her gaze flicking towards the window as if watching the traffic outside held more interest. "These decisions are complex. It's been determined that a change is necessary for the company's forward trajectory." Determined by whom? Concerns raised by whom? The question screamed in his mind, but he swallowed them, the taste metallic. He saw it then, the finality in her posture, the careful lack of specifics. This wasn't a discussion, it was a verdict delivered. As if on cue, Meredith slid a thick manila folder across the starched linen. "This outlines the severance package," she stated, her voice purely transactional now. "It's quite generous, contingent, of course, upon your signing the standard non-disclosure and separation agreement. It covers all proprietary information, intellectual property developed during your tenure, the usual clauses." His eyes scanned the top page. The legalese swam before him, but the message was clear. Take the money and disappear quietly. The NDA section seemed particularly dense. Pressure began to build behind his temples. "Sign now," she implied without saying it. "Make this clean." He pushed the folder back gently, his hand steady despite the tremor running beneath his skin. "Thank you, Meredith. I'll need some time to review this properly, with legal counsel." For the first time, a flicker of something, annoyance, impatience, crossed Meredith Lane's perfectly composed features. It was gone in an instant, replaced by the cool mask, but Calvin saw it. Her lips thinned almost imperceptibly. "It's fairly standard, Calvin. We were hoping to finalize everything today for a smooth transition." "Nevertheless," Calvin said, his voice quiet but firm. He rose from his chair, his legs feeling strangely detached. "I need to review it." He didn't offer a handshake. Neither did she. He turned and walked away, the curated elegance of Bristow Co. feeling suddenly suffocating. As he pushed through the heavy glass doors and stepped onto the bustling sidewalk, the city noise washing over him, the shock began to recede, replaced by a chilling, insistent question that echoed louder than the traffic. It wasn't just the loss of his job, the project he loved, the future he'd envisioned. It was the way it happened. The vagueness of the accusation, the finality that felt preordained, the flicker in Meredith's eyes, the pressure to sign away his rights immediately. Why? Why the sudden, brutal excision? Why the flimsy, insulting excuse? Something was fundamentally wrong. This wasn't just a layoff. This felt orchestrated. And deep down, a cold knot of dread tightened in his gut, whispering that the polished, civil surface of the Lou midnight found Calvin not asleep, but adrift in the blue-tinged darkness of his apartment living room. Sleep was a distant shore he couldn't reach. The remnants of a hastily eaten, barely tasted takeout container sat accusingly on the coffee table. The silence of the apartment was profound, broken only by the low hum of his high-end workstation, a machine largely paid for by Envia bonuses, and the occasional mournful siren cutting through the distant city thrum. He'd tried distraction, scrolling through news feeds, attempting a movie, even digging out an old technical journal. Nothing held. Meredith's clipped, emotionless voice echoed in the quiet, her vague justification, resource allocation, concerns raised, replaying like a corrupted audio file. It felt fundamentally untrue. Calvin was meticulous, almost obsessively so, about protocols and resource management. He built systems designed for efficiency and transparency. The accusation, flimsy as it was, felt like a poorly tailored suit meant to cover something far uglier. What was it covering? The question wouldn't leave him. It gnawed at the edges of his exhaustion. Was there a catastrophic server failure they were pinning on him? An external breach they were trying to bury? His mind, trained to find patterns and anomalies, couldn't rest without data. A flicker of resolve cut through the fog of shock and resentment. He wouldn't get answers from Meredith, but the system he built, it held its own truths in logs and digital footprints. He moved to his workstation, the ergonomic chair sighing under his weight. His fingers, acting almost on autopilot, danced across the keyboard. He pulled up a secure VPN configuration profile, one he'd set up years ago for emergency remote diagnostics, buried deep in his personal settings, likely forgotten by IT security audits focused on more standard remote access methods. It wasn't a malicious backdoor, more like a hidden service entrance he'd built for himself, the architect needing a way to check the foundations without going through the main lobby. He hesitated for only a second. His access credentials should have been revoked the moment Meredith finished her sentence. But the termination was immediate, the paperwork yet unsigned. Perhaps the notoriously overworked IT security team hadn't caught up yet. It was a small window, a gamble. The connection established. Green text scrolled across a dark terminal window, confirming authentication. He was in. A strange mix of relief and transgression washed over him. He navigated the familiar directory structures of Envia's core servers, muscle memory guiding him through firewalls and subnets he knew intimately. His initial checks were routine, almost calming. System health, optimal. Network traffic, nominal. External intrusion detection logs, clean. No major failures, no obvious security breaches from the outside. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Maybe it was just a cold corporate decision, a strategic shift he couldn't see. But the unease lingered. That vague accusation about resource utilization. He decided to check the access logs for Project Chimera's core modules, the complex neural network algorithms that formed the AI's brain. This was the heart of his work, the most sensitive proprietary part of the system. He filtered the logs, setting the time frame for the past month, focusing on administrative-level access to the directories containing the core algorithm code and training data sets. He scrolled through the entries, mostly his own familiar user ID, time-stamped during his long work days and occasional late nights. Standard activity. Then he saw it. An entry logged at 2:17 a.m. 3 Tuesdays ago, another at 3:40 a.m. the previous Friday. Several more scattered across the preceding weeks, always in the dead of night, long after he'd gone home. The accessing user ID wasn't his. It was a high-level administrative credential, SVC Envia Core Admin, one typically used for automated system maintenance or by top-tier system administrators during major updates. But the actions logged weren't maintenance. They were read access commands, targeting specific algorithm files within the Chimera core. Chimera Cognitive Heuristic Engine, Predictive Analysis Matrix v4.2 Core, Neural Linguistic Model, Refined.dat, files containing the very essence of his breakthroughs. More alarmingly, the source IP address wasn't from an automated process. It resolved to a workstation on the executive floor of Envia Tower, an executive or high-level engineering workstation. Calvin went still, his blood running cold. The hum of the workstation seemed to fade into a dull roar. He scrolled back further, finding more instances. Sporadic at first, then becoming more frequent in the last 6 weeks. Someone, using powerful credentials from within the company's trusted inner circle, had been systematically examining the deepest, most valuable parts of his work when they thought no one was looking. The vagueness of Meredith's accusation suddenly snapped into sharp, terrifying focus. It wasn't about his resource usage. It felt like a smokescreen, this hidden, nocturnal access. It felt like prospecting, like someone was surveying his intellectual property, mapping it out. Why? The question hung in the silent, blue-lit room, heavy and menacing. This wasn't random. This wasn't a glitch. This wasn't standard procedure. The cold certainty settled deep in his gut, pushing aside the hurt and confusion. Someone inside Envia, someone with power and high-level access, had deliberately poked around in the heart of his creation, and his abrupt, illogical firing suddenly felt like the final step in clearing the path for whatever they planned to do next with his work. The suspicion was no longer a vague unease. It was a sharp, cold shard of certainty piercing through the night. He was being played, and the game had started long before that lunch at Bristow Co-Dawn painted the cityscape outside Calvin's window in hues of bruised purple and reluctant gray. But the apartment remained steeped in the artificial twilight of monitor glow. Empty coffee cups littered the desk like fallen soldiers around the humming workstation. Calvin hadn't slept. The cold knot of suspicion from the previous night had tightened into an icy certainty that demanded action. The logs showing unauthorized access to Project Chimera's core weren't just an anomaly. They were tracks left by a predator. His focus was absolute, the shock and hurt channeled into the methodical precision of his craft. He zeroed in on the source IP address linked to the SVC Envia Core admin access, 10.1.5.112, an internal address, high up in the network hierarchy, assigned to the executive wing. Standard procedure would have been to report this to IT security immediately. But standard procedure felt like walking into a trap. He was isolated, his reputation already tarnished by Meredith's vague pronouncements. He needed irrefutable proof before making any move. Accessing the company's full network allocation tables and workstation assignment logs should have been impossible now. His primary credentials were dead, but Calvin knew the labyrinth he'd helped design. He remembered a read-only diagnostic portal linked to the network asset management system, often overlooked in security sweeps because it didn't allow modifications. Using a cached credential from a previous diagnostic session that hadn't fully expired, he slipped through the digital crack. The asset management database loaded slowly, reluctantly yielding its secrets. He cross-referenced 10.1.5.112. The result appeared on screen, stark and unblinking. IP 10.1.5.112. Assigned device Enviadsk exec07. Primary user Mthorn location floor 22, office 2204, Mthorn. Marcus Thorne. Calvin stared at the screen, the letters blurring. It had to be a mistake. A network reconfiguration he wasn't aware of? Maybe Marcus's workstation had been compromised? He frantically searched for logs indicating a security breach on Marcus's machine, signs of remote access, malware, anything. The logs were clean, pristine even. He ran a correlation check. The timestamps of the suspicious SVC Envia Core admin access from Marcus's IP against Marcus's own login, logout records, and building security badge swipes. Another system he found a read-only backdoor into, remembering a specific debug query string. The pattern emerged, cold and damning. The late-night Chimera core access consistently occurred after Marcus had badged out for the day, but before the final nightly security sweep, often originating from his physical workstation. It suggested someone physically present at Marcus's desk, using high-level credentials during off hours. Or Marcus himself, staying late, off the official clock. No, it couldn't be Marcus, his friend. His collaborator, the guy who'd clapped him on the back after the successful Chimera Alpha demo just weeks ago, saying, "You did it, Cal. You actually cracked it." The guy he'd shared countless beers and late-night coding sessions with, dreaming up the future of AI. The best man at his wedding years ago. His mind rebelled, desperately seeking alternative explanations. Could someone else have gained access to Marcus's office? Unlikely on the secure executive floor. Could they have stolen his credentials? Perhaps, but using them so brazenly, so consistently from his own machine. And why use the generic SVC Envia Core admin account instead of Marcus's personal admin rights if it was an external hacker? Using the service account suggested someone internal trying to obfuscate their specific identity while still leveraging high privileges. Someone who knew the system. Someone like the memory of Marcus asking strangely detailed questions about Chimera's failsafes and data encryption protocols in recent weeks hit him like a physical blow. Questions Calvin had dismissed at the time as Marcus just doing his VP due diligence, wanting to understand the crown jewels he was overseeing. Now, those questions felt chillingly purposeful. He remembered Marcus's slight, almost imperceptible coolness lately, the way he'd sometimes avoid eye contact when discussing Chimera's long-term roadmap. Calvin had chalked it up to the pressure of the VP role. He'd been a fool. The final piece clicked into place with sickening clarity. The concerns about resource utilization Meredith mentioned. Perhaps Marcus had fabricated them, pointing to Calvin's minor side project as a convenient excuse. Marcus, as VP of Engineering, would have Meredith's ear. He could easily frame Calvin, clearing the way. Clearing the way for what? To take credit for Chimera himself. The pain was sharp, visceral, a betrayal that cut deeper than any corporate maneuvering. It felt like a part of his own history had been corrupted. The camaraderie, the shared ambition, had it all been a lie? Had Marcus harbored this resentment, this treacherous intent, all along, hidden behind a mask of friendship? He leaned back, the fight draining out of him for a moment, replaced by a hollow ache. Then, slowly, something else began to stir in the wreckage. A cold fire. The shock morphed into a quiet, simmering rage. This wasn't just about a stolen job or even stolen code. This was a profound, personal violation. He turned back to the logs, his focus renewed, sharper now, edged with ice. The question was no longer just who, but why. And more importantly, what exactly had Marcus done with the access? Had he merely looked? Or had he taken something? He started digging deeper into the system logs, searching for signs of data exfiltration, large file transfers originating from Marcus's IP around the times of the suspicious access. The hunt wasn't over. It had just become personal. He needed to know the full extent of the betrayal, the final destination of his stolen work. He needed to understand the endgame of the friend who had driven the knife in his back. The scent of baby powder and sterilizing solution hung faintly in the air, a stark contrast to the sterile chill of Envia Tower or the stale coffee aroma of Calvin's apartment. Ava Sharma's apartment was bright, filled with midday sun streaming through large windows overlooking a quiet, tree-lined street. Toys were scattered with cheerful abandon in one corner, and a sleek, modern baby swing sat motionless near the sofa. It felt like a different universe. Ava, dressed in comfortable yoga pants and a loose-fitting top, greeted him with a tired but warm smile. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, badges of early motherhood, but her gaze was as sharp as he remembered from their days navigating Envia's legal minefields together. She ushered him in, offering coffee he declined, and water he accepted gratefully. "Calvin, it's unexpected," she said, settling onto the sofa opposite him after checking the baby monitor nestled beside her. "Everything okay? You look like you've seen a ghost, or wrestled one." He tried a smile, but it felt brittle. "Something like that, Ava. Thanks for seeing me on such short notice. I know you're busy. Leo's finally sleeping, so I have a window." She waved a dismissive hand. "What's going on? You left Envia?" The question hung in the air, laced with unspoken curiosity. News traveled fast, even to someone on leave. Calvin took a deep breath. He trusted Ava. She'd always been fiercely intelligent, meticulously ethical, and possessed a healthy skepticism towards corporate platitudes, especially Meredith Lane's. He didn't unload the full technical detail of the logs or the raw pain of Marcus's betrayal yet. That felt too overwhelming, too raw for this calm space. He kept it concise, focusing on the core injustice. "I didn't leave Ava. I was terminated. Thursday. Meredith cited improper resource utilization, he said, the phrase tasting like ash. It was vague, sudden, and felt completely wrong. Since then, he hesitated, choosing his words carefully. I have strong reasons to believe my core work on Project Chimera, specifically intellectual property I developed before joining Envia, has been compromised internally and is potentially being misappropriated. Ava's expression shifted from friendly concern to sharp professional focus. She leaned forward slightly. Compromised how? Misappropriated by whom? I'm still gathering the specifics. Calvin hedged, not ready to name Marcus yet, not until he had incontrovertible proof. But the termination feels like part of a larger plan to sideline me and take control of the Chimera IP. Which brings me to why I'm here. Do you remember about 2.5 years ago when we integrated the Synapse module into Chimera? Ava frowned in concentration, then nodded slowly. Vaguely. That was your foundational algorithm, right? The one you brought with you. We had to draft something specific because it wasn't work for hire developed at Envia. A sublicense, I think? Relief washed over Calvin. She remembered. Exactly. A sublicense agreement. It explicitly stated that Envia was licensing the core Synapse code from me, acknowledging my prior ownership, even though it was being integrated. You drafted it, Meredith signed off, or maybe it was Harrison Wells back then. We filed it through the standard legal portal. I remember, Ava affirmed, her gaze distant for a moment as she accessed her own mental archives. It was necessary to protect both you and the company, defining clear boundaries for that specific piece of IP. Standard practice for integrating pre-existing technology. She paused, her eyes narrowing slightly. Why? Because that agreement is my proof of ownership, Calvin said, leaning forward, his voice low and urgent. Proof that the heart of Chimera isn't wholly Envia's property. If they're planning to sell Chimera, or leverage it in a way that ignores my foundational contribution, they'd be in breach and potentially infringing on your IP, Ava finished, understanding dawning in her eyes, followed quickly by concern. Okay, let me see if I can pull it up. She retrieved a sleek laptop from a nearby table, balancing it on her knees. Despite being on leave, some tendrils of access remained. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, navigating Envia's labyrinthine digital filing system. Calvin watched, his heart pounding against his ribs. This was it, the linchpin. Ava's brow furrowed. She typed furiously, ran different searches, tried accessing archive directories. The silence stretched, punctuated only by her sharp intakes of breath and the soft clicking of keys. Finally, she looked up, her expression troubled. It's gone, Calvin. Gone? The word dropped into the quiet room like a stone. What do you mean gone? It has to be there. Legal documents don't just disappear. This one apparently did, Ava said grimly. I've checked the active repository, the archives, even the legacy backup system I still have limited access to. The file reference number exists, but the document itself, deleted or access restricted at a level beyond my current credentials. The deletion log entry is vague. System cleanup Q3. That's not standard procedure for executed contracts. A cold dread seeped back into Calvin. This wasn't negligence. This was deliberate. Someone had gone in and scrubbed the official record of his ownership. Someone who knew exactly what that document represented. Someone like Marcus, with his high-level access and technical skill. The cover-up was deeper, more meticulous than he'd imagined. He slumped back against the sofa, the hope draining away, replaced by a gnawing despair. Without that agreement, It was his word against Envia's corporate machine. Ava watched him, her lips pressed into a thin line. She seemed lost in thought for a long moment, tapping a finger against her chin. The baby monitor crackled softly. Then, her eyes lit up with a sudden spark of recollection. "Wait," she said, her voice regaining its energy. "Wait just a minute. The digital copy might be gone. But standard procedure back then, especially for IP agreements. We always made one physical copy for the central file, and sometimes..." She trailed off, digging through her memory. "Sometimes what, Ava?" Calvin asked, leaning forward again, barely daring to breathe. "Sometimes," Ava said slowly, a smile spreading across her face. "If I was particularly cautious, or if I thought the VP involved was slippery, and let's be honest, Marcus always had an ambitious streak, I'd request a second hard copy, stamped, signed, dated, for my personal reference file, just in case." She met Calvin's gaze, hope dawning in her eyes. "I cleared out my office in a rush before Leo arrived, packed everything into boxes. Those boxes are in storage." Her smile widened. I think I might still have it, Calvin. The original paper contract with the official company seal." The metallic screech of the roll-up door echoed unnervingly in the cavernous quiet of the self-storage facility. It was well past midnight, and the long corridors, lined with identical anonymous doors under the stark glare of fluorescent lights, felt deserted and vaguely liminal. The air hung cool and still, smelling faintly of dust, concrete, and the forgotten contents behind sealed metal. Calvin pulled the heavy door upwards, revealing the dimly lit cube of Ava's storage unit. Stacked high were cardboard boxes, meticulously labeled in Ava's neat, precise handwriting. Baby clothes, 0, 6 mm. Kitchenware, non-essential. Office files, personal. His target was the latter category. Armed with a powerful flashlight Ava had given him along with the key and gate code, he stepped inside. Dust motes danced in the beam as he scanned the labels. Tax records 2018-2021, law school notes, bar exam prep. He started pulling down the boxes marked office files, personal, the cardboard groaning under the weight of densely packed paper. He worked methodically, carefully opening each box, sifting through folders filled with old case notes, performance reviews, drafts of forgotten memos. The detritus of a demanding legal career paused for motherhood. The initial surge of adrenaline began to fade, replaced by a gnawing anxiety. What if Ava was mistaken? What if she'd thrown it out during the pre-baby purge? What if it was damaged, illegible? Each empty folder, each irrelevant document felt like a small defeat. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, amplifying the silence and his own mounting desperation. He wiped a bead of sweat from his brow, the cool air doing little to combat the internal heat of his search. He was halfway through the third office files box, the contents blurring before his tired eyes: seminar handouts, employee handbooks, drafts of non-compete clauses, when his fingers brushed against something different. Not loose papers, but a bound document within a slightly thicker, legal-sized manila envelope. It wasn't labeled externally. His heart gave a painful lurch. With trembling hands, he pulled the envelope out. It felt heavier than standard paper. He laid it carefully on top of a nearby box, the flashlight beam steady upon it. He recognized Ava's handwriting in small script in the top corner. Sublic. AGMT. CR Synapse. Executed copy. His breath hitched. He slid the document out of the envelope. It was printed on thick, cream-colored bond paper, slightly yellowed at the edges, cool to the touch. The familiar Envia Robotics logo was embossed at the top. He scanned the legalese, his eyes flying over the clauses until they landed on the critical paragraphs defining Synapse as pre-existing intellectual property belonging to Calvin Rhodes, licensed to Envia for integration into Project Chimera under specific terms. And there, on the final page, were the signatures. His own, penned nearly 3 years ago, Meredith Lane's sharp, angular signature beneath his, and Ava Sharma's clear and professional as witness. Below the signatures, pressed firmly into the paper, leaving a distinct indentation that caught the light, was the circular, intricate official seal of Envia Robotics. He ran his fingertip over the raised edge of the seal, the tangible proof grounding him. It was real, undeniable, undeletable. They could scrub the digital records, gaslight him with corporate jargon, erase him from the company roster, but they couldn't erase this physical artifact, this legally binding acknowledgement of his ownership, stamped with their own official mark of authenticity. Tucked behind the agreement, as if placed there deliberately by Ava's meticulous past self, was a thin sheaf of papers. He recognized them instantly. Early printouts of the Synapse algorithm architecture, dated nearly 8 months before his official start date at Envia. More proof. Context. History. A wave of profound relief washed over him, so potent it almost buckled his knees. It wasn't triumphant joy, not yet. It was the grim satisfaction of a soldier finding his weapon in the dark, just as the enemy closed in. The despair that had gnawed at him since leaving Bristow Co. receded, replaced by a cold, hard clarity. He carefully slid the documents back into the manila envelope, holding it like a sacred text. They hadn't just fired him. They hadn't just stolen his work. They had actively tried to erase his claim, to rewrite history for their own gain, orchestrated by the man he once called friend. They thought they had buried the truth. Standing there in the dusty silence of the storage unit, under the unforgiving fluorescent glare, Calvin Rhodes knew one thing with absolute certainty. He now held the blueprint for their destruction. The game wasn't over. It had merely changed shape. And he finally had the leverage to play his hand. The main auditorium of the National Tech Conference buzzed with the low hum of anticipation. Thousands of attendees, engineers, investors, journalists, competitors, filled the tiered seating, their faces illuminated by the glow of smartphones and the dazzling stage lights. On the massive central screen, the sleek Envia Robotics logo pulsed gently, promising innovation, disruption, the future. Today was Envia's keynote, rumored to unveil a groundbreaking AI advancement, possibly in partnership with the industry giant, Nexus Dynamics. Backstage, amidst the controlled chaos of technicians checking cables and presenters reviewing notes, Calvin Rhodes felt strangely calm. The cold fire that had ignited in the storage unit now burned with focused intensity. He wore a simple dark jacket over a button-down shirt, blending in enough not to draw immediate attention. His conference badge, obtained using an old contact and some carefully worded emails, clipped unobtrusively. In his hand, disguised within a standard tablet case, was his weapon, a custom-coded interface linked to a small, powerful exploit he'd discovered days earlier in the conference's notoriously outdated AV network control system. A backdoor left open by lazy patching. He watched the monitors showing the stage. Meredith Lane strode confidently to the podium, bathed in the spotlight, radiating polished authority. She spoke of Envia's vision, of pushing boundaries, of synergistic partnerships shaping the next technological epoch. Standard CEO fare, delivered flawlessly. Then, she introduced the architect of their latest triumph. And now, Meredith announced, her voice resonating through the auditorium, to walk you through the technical marvel that is Project Ascend, please welcome our brilliant VP of Engineering, Marcus Thorne. Applause rippled through the crowd as Marcus emerged from the wings, smiling broadly. waving almost imperceptibly to someone in the front rows, perhaps the Nexus Dynamics executives seated there. He looked confident, energized, every inch the successful tech visionary. Calvin felt a fresh stab of bile rise in his throat, quickly swallowed. Ascend. They hadn't even bothered to change the core project name significantly, just repackaged it. Marcus launched into his presentation. Slides filled the giant screen, elegant graphics depicting neural networks, data flows, performance benchmarks that looked suspiciously identical to Chimera's latest internal reports. He spoke with practiced enthusiasm about breakthrough optimizations, novel heuristic approaches, and synergistic data integration, carefully avoiding any mention of the foundational Synapse module, the heart Calvin had built. Calvin watched Marcus point proudly at a complex diagram illustrating the AI's cognitive architecture. This core, Marcus declared, gesturing expansively, represents years of dedicated work by the Envia team, culminating in an engine capable of unprecedented predictive accuracy. Now, Calvin's fingers moved swiftly on his hidden tablet. He initiated the exploit sequence. On the main stage, the slick Envia graphic behind Marcus flickered for a fraction of a second, then dissolved. Marcus faltered mid-sentence, momentarily confused. Meredith frowned from her seat at the side of the stage. In place of the Envia presentation, a simple title card appeared on the massive screen. Project Chimera. The Truth, by Calvin Rhodes, original architect. A murmur swept through the auditorium. Heads turned, phones were raised, recording. Marcus stared at the screen, his confident smile frozen, then collapsing into disbelief. Meredith shot to her feet, frantically signaling to the AV technicians in the wings, but the system was unresponsive to their frantic clicks. Calvin's script had locked them out. Calvin's face appeared on the screen, a pre-recorded video, calm, steady, looking directly into the camera, and thus, out at the thousands watching. "My name is Calvin Rhodes," his recorded voice echoed, clear and amplified through the auditorium speakers. "For 3 years, I was the chief AI architect at Envia Robotics and the lead developer of Project Chimera." The screen split. On one side, the scanned image of the sublicense agreement appeared, the signatures and official Envia seal clearly visible. "This document, executed 2.5 years ago, confirms my prior ownership of the core Synapse algorithm, licensed to Envia for integration into Chimera." The screen changed again, now showing a side-by-side comparison. On the left, lines of Synapse chalk Chimera code from Calvin's original repository. On the right, code snippets extracted from the Project Ascend files Marcus had inadvertently left traces of accessing. Highlighted sections showed undeniable, extensive overlap. Entire functions copied verbatim, variable names barely altered. "What Mr. Thorne is presenting today as Project Ascend," Calvin's voice continued, cold and precise, "is not a new innovation. It is a misappropriation. A theft of intellectual property built on a foundation Envia does not own." Gasps rippled through the audience. Journalists were scribbling furiously. The Nexus executives looked stunned, then furious, exchanging sharp whispers. On stage, Marcus was ashen, shaking his head, muttering, "No, this is wrong." Meredith's composure had shattered. She looked trapped, her eyes darting between the screen and the unresponsive tech booth. The audio cut off. The silence in the auditorium was deafening. Marcus looked physically ill. The final image appeared on screen. Excerpts from encrypted emails Calvin had managed to partially decrypt, showing communications between Marcus and Meredith discussing the Rhodes obstacle and the timeline for the transition, coinciding with Nexus partnership talks. Calvin's recorded image returned. This wasn't just corporate restructuring, he stated, his voice resonating with controlled fury. This was a calculated betrayal, orchestrated to steal my work and silence my claim, facilitated by executives entrusted with ethical leadership. They didn't just take my job, they tried to erase my contribution and sell it as their own. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. The truth, he concluded, always finds the light. The screen went black. Chaos erupted. Shouts from the audience. Flashes popped relentlessly. Security personnel finally broke through Calvin's digital lockdown and rushed the stage, surrounding a stunned Marcus and a visibly trembling Meredith. The Nexus executives were already on their feet, storming towards the exit, their faces grim. Someone in the audience yelled, "Check Envia stock!" And instantly, hundreds of phones lit up, murmurs turning to shocked exclamations as the ticker symbol presumably plummeted in real time. Calvin, having slipped out from backstage during the pandemonium, watched from the shadowed exit tunnel. He saw the shattered careers, the imploding deal, the public disgrace. It wasn't triumph, he felt. Not exactly. It was the cold, hard satisfaction of scales violently rebalanced. Justice, served raw and public on the very stage they'd chosen for their deceitful coronation. The blueprint he'd unearthed hadn't just proven his ownership, it had detonated their carefully constructed world. 3 months later, the view from the sleek, minimalist conference room wasn't of a bustling city street, but of the serene, blue expanse of Lake Travis shimmering under the Texas sun. The law offices of Chen Associates occupied the top floor of a modern building far removed from the downtown tech corridor, a deliberate choice by Calvin. The air conditioning hummed softly, a peaceful counterpoint to the frantic energy of the National Tech Conference that now felt like a lifetime ago. Across the polished mahogany table, Ava Sharma, looking rested and sharp in a professional blazer, Leo presumably with a sitter or her partner, slid a final document towards Calvin. Her personal files, including the stamped contract, had been instrumental. She'd officially come on board as his legal counsel shortly after the conference fiasco, her initial pro bono advice solidifying into a formidable legal strategy. "Final signature here, Calvin," Ava said, tapping a pen beside a highlighted line. "This confirms Envia's formal relinquishment of any claim to the Synapse core and all derivative works identified. It also finalizes the settlement amount." Calvin picked up the pen. The settlement figure was substantial, a number reflecting not just the theft of his IP, but the damage to his career and the public fallout Envia had suffered. News outlets had feasted on the story. The dramatic keynote interruption, the subsequent stock plunge, the hasty withdrawal by Nexus Dynamics, and the inevitable executive shakeup. He signed his name, the ink flowing smoothly, decisively. It wasn't a flourish of victory, but the closing of a painful chapter. "Done," he said, sliding the document back to Ava. "So, that's really it?" Ava smiled, gathering the papers. "Legally, yes. Envia transfers the agreed-upon funds within 48 hours. They retain a non-exclusive license for the integrated version of Chimera for internal use only for 6 months, per the transition clause we negotiated, just to avoid complete operational collapse on their end. After that, they need a new commercial license from you, which I doubt they'll pursue. They're already scrambling to build something else, anything else." "And Meredith? Marcus?" Calvin asked, the names still leaving a faintly bitter taste. Ava's smile tightened slightly. Meredith was ousted by the board within a week. Golden parachute significantly clipped due to breach of fiduciary duty. Last I heard, she's consulting quietly, persona non grata in the major tech circles. Marcus. Ava paused, her expression hardening. "He's facing multiple lawsuits. Envia is suing him for damages and breach of contract. Nexus Dynamics is exploring legal action for misrepresentation. And the SEC is investigating potential market manipulation related to the partnership announcement. His career isn't just over, it's radioactive. There might even be criminal charges pending regarding trade secret theft. Calvin nodded slowly. There was no elation, no surge of vindictive pleasure, just a quiet, somber acknowledgement of consequences deserved. He thought of the years of friendship, the shared dreams, now reduced to legal filings and cautionary tales. The waste of it all felt heavy. They thought they could just take it, he murmured, more to himself than to Ava, looking out at the calm lake. Hubris and greed, Ava stated simply. A potent combination. They underestimated you, Calvin, and they underestimated the value of integrity. She stacked the files neatly. So, what's next for the man who owns the core of one of the most advanced AI systems out there? Calvin leaned back, a thoughtful expression replacing the tension that had resided on his face for months. Offers have come in, he admitted. Big names, tempting packages. Head of AI research here, lead architect there. They all want Chimera, or rather, Synapse. And? Ava prompted gently. He shook his head. I spent years building something within someone else's walls, playing by their rules, trusting their structures. Look where it got me. He met Ava's gaze. I'm starting my own shop. Synapse AI. Small, focused, building solutions based on the core I developed, but on my terms. No VCs breathing down my neck initially, just bootstrapping with the settlement. Ava's eyes lit up. I had a feeling you might say that. Need a good general counsel? Calvin grinned, the first genuine, uncomplicated smile in months. Only the best. Interested? Leo might need a college fund, she quipped, though her expression was serious. Let's talk terms. Later that day, Calvin stood in the empty space he'd leased, a modest office suite with large windows overlooking a different part of the lake, closer to the city, but still peaceful. Boxes containing his salvaged personal effects and new equipment sat unopened. The late afternoon sun slanted across the bare floor. He didn't feel the crushing weight of betrayal anymore, nor the frantic energy of the fight. What remained was a scar, a reminder of the cost of trust misplaced, but also a quiet certainty in his own worth and capability. He had faced down corporate power, exposed deceit, and reclaimed what was rightfully his. It hadn't made him whole in the way he might have naively expected before it all began, but it had forged something new, a steely resolve, a clearer vision of the future he wanted to build. He walked to the window, looking out as the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in strokes of orange and gold. It wasn't about winning, he realized, echoing a thought from long ago. It was about value, knowing his own, and ensuring it was never undervalued or stolen again. He pulled out his phone, not to check emails or news feeds, but to make a call to the first potential hire for Synapse AI, a brilliant young coder from his old team at Envia, who had quietly expressed support after the fallout. The first brick of his new foundation was about to be laid, on his own terms. In the clear light of a new dawn, 6 months after the settlement ink had dried, the offices of Synapse AI still smelled faintly of fresh paint and new beginnings. Gone were the unopened boxes. In their place stood minimalist desks, powerful workstations humming quietly, and large whiteboards covered in complex diagrams and lines of elegant code. Calvin's familiar handwriting mixed with a newer, equally precise script. Sunlight streamed through the large windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air, but this time it felt energizing, not sterile. Calvin stood beside Maya Sharma, the brilliant young coder he'd called first. Maya, barely 30, possessed an intensity and a quiet passion for ethical AI development that had always impressed him during their time at Envia. She had jumped at the chance to join Synapse AI, resigning from the demoralized shell of Envia's AI division almost immediately. They were huddled around a server rack tucked neatly in a cooled closet, watching lines of diagnostic text scroll rapidly across a monitor perched precariously on top. All right, network interfaces configured, security protocols hardened, baseline diagnostics running clean, Maya reported, her fingers flying across a keyboard connected directly to the server. Ready to initialize the core Synapse instance? Calvin nodded, a familiar knot of anticipation tightening in his chest, but this time it was laced with excitement, not dread. Let's bring her online, independent for the first time. This wasn't just booting up software. This was resurrection. This was taking the core algorithm, the very essence of his work that Marcus and Meredith had tried to steal and commodify, and running it purely on their own hardware, under their own control, free from Envia's tainted infrastructure and corporate politics. Maya executed the final command sequence. The scrolling text paused, then new lines appeared, indicating processes initializing, databases connecting, neural pathways activating within the code. They watched in shared, focused silence. A progress bar crawled across the screen. It felt suffocating near the end at Envia, Maya said quietly, her eyes still fixed on the monitor. After you left, and especially after the conference, the atmosphere was toxic. Fear, blame, endless pointless meetings trying to figure out how to reverse engineer your work without admitting they needed it. Marcus was unhinged. It was a relief to get out. I'm sorry you had to go through that, Calvin said sincerely, but I'm glad you're here now, Maya. Me too, she replied, a small smile touching her lips. Building something clean, something based on actual innovation, not whatever that mess was, it feels right. We're doing it the right way. Calvin felt a surge of affirmation. That was the core principle of Synapse AI: transparency, collaboration, and valuing the human ingenuity behind the code, not just the potential profit. They would build groundbreaking AI, yes, but they would do it ethically, fostering an environment where talent was nurtured, not exploited or betrayed. The progress bar reached 100%. A final line of text appeared. Synapse Core V1.0 initialization complete. All systems nominal. A collective sigh of relief escaped them both. Maya grinned, turning to Calvin. She's alive, and she's ours. Calvin clapped her lightly on the shoulder, a wide smile breaking across his face. It was a small step, just getting the core running on their own servers, but it felt monumental. The first tangible proof of concept for Synapse AI, achieved not by a vast team under corporate pressure, but by two dedicated individuals in their own space, on their own terms. Later that afternoon, while Maya sketched out architecture for their first client project on a whiteboard, Calvin took a brief break, scrolling through a news aggregator on his tablet. An inconspicuous headline caught his eye. Thorn legal woes mount as former Envia VP faces potential wire fraud charges. The short article detailed the ongoing SEC investigation and a new civil suit filed by disgruntled Envia shareholders. There was a small, unflattering photo of Marcus entering a courthouse, looking haggard and defeated. Calvin read it without malice, almost dispassionately. The wheels of justice, slow and grinding, were doing their work. He felt no need to track Marcus's downfall. It was a separate reality now, a ghost from a past he was actively building away from. He closed the article, his focus returning to the whiteboard where Maya was mapping out the future. That was where his energy belonged now. Not looking back at the wreckage, but forward, at the clean lines of code, the challenging problems, the potential waiting to be unlocked, ethically, collaboratively, and this time, undeniably his own. The first brick had been laid, solid and true. 2 years had passed since the tumultuous National Tech Conference. Synapse AI was no longer just Calvin and Maya in a sparsely furnished office. It now occupied a larger, brighter space in the same lakeside building, buzzing with the quiet energy of a dozen carefully chosen engineers and researchers. They had landed several key clients, impressed not only by the power of the Synapse core, but also by Calvin's insistence on ethical deployment and transparent collaboration. The company was building a reputation for cutting-edge work, delivered with integrity, the antithesis of the Envia he'd escaped. Calvin was reviewing architectural diagrams with Maya and 2 senior engineers when Ava Sharma, now Synapse AI's indispensable general counsel and head of operations, having proven adept at far more than just law, poked her head into the glass-walled conference room. "Calvin, sorry to interrupt," Ava said, a slight smile playing on her lips. "Someone's here to see you. No appointment, but I thought you might want to." Calvin raised an eyebrow. Ava rarely broke protocol. "Oh? Who is it?" "Harrison Wells." The name hung in the air for a moment. Harrison Wells, the former majority owner of Envia Robotics, the man whose nephew, briefly, replaced Calvin's counterpart in the original story's inspiration, and the figurehead behind Meredith and Marcus's ambition. He hadn't been directly implicated in the Chimera theft scandal, having distanced himself financially before the worst of it, but his passive acceptance or willful ignorance had certainly enabled it. Calvin exchanged a look with Ava. Curiosity warred with a residual weariness. "All right," he said slowly. "Show him into my office." "Give me 5 minutes." Harrison Wells looked older than Calvin remembered, the aura of invincible tech mogul slightly diminished. The bespoke suit hung a little looser. The lines around his eyes were deeper. He stood by the large window in Calvin's office, looking out at the lake, his hands clasped behind his back. "Mr. Rhodes, Calvin," Wells greeted, turning as Calvin entered. His tone was subdued, lacking its former easy command. "Thank you for seeing me." "Mr. Wells," Calvin replied neutrally, gesturing towards a chair. "Please, what can I do for you?" He remained standing behind his desk, maintaining a polite distance. Wells didn't sit immediately. He surveyed the office, the clean lines, the lack of ostentation, the framed print of a complex mathematical theorem on the wall. "You've built something impressive here. Quietly impressive." "We focus on the work," Calvin said simply. Wells nodded slowly. "Envia is a shadow of its former self. Sold for parts, essentially, last quarter. The brand is worthless. The IP portfolio gutted by lawsuits and distrust." He finally met Calvin's gaze. Meredith lost everything. Marcus is likely facing prison time. Calvin said nothing, waiting. "I wasn't directly involved in what they did to you," Wells stated, a hint of defensiveness in his voice. "I'd already stepped back from active management, preparing for the Nexus deal I thought was solid. You signed off on my initial sublicense agreement," Calvin reminded him quietly. "You knew Synapse was my foundational work." Wells had the grace to look momentarily uncomfortable. "Yes, a detail I perhaps overlooked amidst the larger strategic picture. An error." He sighed, a sound like air leaking from a punctured tire. "Meredith and Marcus pitched me a vision of rapid expansion, leveraging the AI for a quick, high-value acquisition. They assured me the personnel changes were necessary streamlining." "Streamlining," Calvin echoed, the word still tasting faintly of betrayal. "I see now it was theft, plain and simple," Wells admitted. his voice barely above a whisper, driven by their greed and ambition. I was, perhaps willfully blind because the potential payout was so large. He finally sat down, looking less like a titan of industry and more like an old man contemplating his legacy. I came here today not to make excuses, Calvin, but to acknowledge you were wronged, badly. And what you built here, he gestured vaguely around the office, proves they backed the wrong horse. They destroyed value chasing phantoms while you created real substance. Calvin considered the man before him. The anger he might have felt years ago was gone, replaced by a kind of detached pity. Wells wasn't the architect of the betrayal, merely the complacent enabler who had reaped only ashes. "Thank you for saying that, Mr. Wells," Calvin said, his tone still neutral but perhaps a fraction less guarded. "Is there anything else?" Wells hesitated. "I suppose I wanted to see if there was any interest from Synapse AI in acquiring some of the residual, non-toxic assets from Envia's liquidation. Server hardware, some unrelated patents, at bargain prices, naturally." Calvin almost smiled. Even now, a deal. "Thank you for the offer, Mr. Wells, but no. We're building Synapse AI from the ground up with clean foundations. We don't need Envia's ghosts." Wells nodded slowly, seeming to understand. He stood up, looking weary. "I suspected as much." "Well," he offered a hand across the desk. "I wish you continued success, Calvin. Truly. You earned it." Calvin shook the offered hand briefly. It felt like closing a final, distant door. After Wells had left, Ava appeared in the doorway. "Everything all right?" "Fine," Calvin said, turning back to the window, watching Wells's expensive car pull away far below. "Just echoes." "He looked like a man who realized too late what he'd lost," Ava observed. "He enabled it," Calvin stated simply. But the architects were Meredith and Marcus. He looked around his office, at the hum of activity beyond the glass, at Maya already back at the whiteboard. "This is what matters now. What we're building." He picked up a marker and headed back to the conference room, leaving the ghosts of Envia and Harrison Wells behind him. The focus was forward, on the clean code, the ethical framework, the collaborative future of Synapse AI. The past was acknowledged, the scales rebalanced, but the real work, the truly satisfying work, was just beginning. 5 years. 5 years since Calvin Rhodes had walked out of Bristow Bistro, his world abruptly shattered. 5 years since that frantic midnight search through server logs had revealed the first cracks of betrayal. 5 years since the public detonation at the National Tech Conference. He stood now on the wooden deck of a modest but beautifully situated cabin overlooking Lake Travis. The setting sun painted the sky in fiery oranges, soft pinks, and deep purples, the colors reflecting and shifting on the calm surface of the water. The air was warm, carrying the scent of pine and distant barbecue smoke. A comfortable silence enveloped him, broken only by the gentle lapping of water against the shore and the chirp of early evening crickets. Synapse AI wasn't just stable, it was thriving. They were leaders in ethical AI implementation, sought after for their transparent practices as much as their powerful technology. Maya was now his COO, a brilliant and steady hand guiding operations. Ava, having built a robust legal and operational framework, was exploring a transition to a more strategic advisory role, balancing work with raising Leo. They had built not just a successful company, but a good one, founded on the principles Calvin had fought for. He held a simple glass of amber liquid, a good Texas whiskey, swirling it gently, watching the light refract through it. He rarely thought about Envia anymore. The names Meredith Lane and Marcus Thorne were footnotes in tech history, cautionary tales whispered in boardrooms. Harrison Wells had faded into quiet retirement, his legacy irrevocably tarnished. The desire for revenge, that cold fire that had fueled him through the darkest days, had long since cooled, leaving behind not emptiness, but a quiet sense of equilibrium. He hadn't just reclaimed his work, he had reclaimed his narrative, his future. He hadn't let the betrayal define him. Instead, he had used its harsh lessons to build something better, something truer to his own values. A soft footstep sounded on the deck behind him. It was Ava, holding 2 mugs. She'd driven out for the weekend, a working retreat mixed with relaxation. "Thought you might need a refill," she said, handing him one of the mugs, coffee, his usual evening preference despite the whiskey already in hand. "Or maybe just some company." "Thanks, Ava," he smiled, accepting the mug. They stood side by side, watching the last sliver of sun dip below the horizon. "Penny for your thoughts?" Ava asked after a comfortable silence. "You look a million miles away." "Thinking about the early days?" Calvin took a sip of coffee. "Sometimes. Less often now. Mostly just grateful that we found that contract in your storage unit." He chuckled softly. "That you were meticulous enough to keep a paper copy." "Always cover your bases," Ava grinned. "Lawyer 101, especially when dealing with slippery VPs." Her grin faded slightly. "It was a nasty fight, Calvin. You could have just taken the settlement Envia initially offered after the conference blew up. Walked away richer, maybe." "Maybe," Calvin conceded. "But it wasn't just about the money, was it? Or even just the IP. It was about the principle, about not letting them get away with erasing the truth, erasing contribution." He looked out at the darkening water. "It was about value, proving mine, and perhaps reminding them of the value they destroyed." "You did that," Ava said quietly, "and built something better in its place." They stood in silence again as the first stars began to prick the twilight sky. The anger, the pain, the consuming need for retribution, they felt like distant echoes now, ripples fading on the surface of the lake. What remained was the quiet strength of having navigated the storm, the satisfaction of building something meaningful from the wreckage, and the peace of knowing, finally, his own undeniable worth. He raised his whiskey glass slightly, a silent toast not to victory or revenge, but to resilience, to integrity, and to the calm beauty of the sunset painting the water before him. The past was history, the future was bright, and the present, here on this quiet deck, was finally, truly peaceful. The revenge had been served, yes, but the real prize was the life he had built afterwards.